This is Mollie Hemingway, encouraging you to listen to my favorite podcast, Issues, Etc. Every day you get in-depth interviews with host Todd Wilkin asking expert guests substantive, thought-provoking questions on all of the important news and issues of our day. The expert guests are in culture, law, ethics, philosophy, theology, and apologetics. Expert guests, expansive topics, always extolling Christ. Issues, etc.
Voting takes place this Saturday, June 13th through Tuesday, June 16th for President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. If you're a registered voter for the 2026 LCMS presidential election, please vote to re-elect Issues Etc. regular guest, Pastor Matt Harrison. If you're not a voter, encourage your pastor and your congregation's lay voter to vote for President Harrison. Official ballots have been mailed to all registered voters. Remember to vote June 13th through the 16th.
The emperor has no clothes on. He's buck naked. That child had to speak the truth no matter how it would make the king feel. And we have to do that today. We have to be very conscientious objectors to the madness that is gender ideology.
And most people default into this idea of feminism is this idea that men are contemptible, which is, of course, the idea behind the smashing the patriarchy, and women need to be just like them and have the same equality.
The Crusades were a very belated response to many centuries of Muslim conquests, in which 2/3 of the old Christian world had already fallen to Muslim conquest.
And our faith is strong, not because of the fervor of its affection, but because of the object to which it clings, Christ. And there is no stronger faith than a really timid grasping to the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Families sailing on their family vacation on lakes in Minnesota love Issues Etc.
We love Issues Etc.
There is a mystique that surrounds Supreme Court justices. They live in a little bubble. They have their beautiful building there in Washington, D.C. Until recently, you could maybe get an audio recording of some time when they, on occasion, hear arguments. And even then, it's mostly the justices asking the questions. Their lives are, well, if I were a Supreme Court justice, I would be living a private life too. But what is it like to become a Supreme Court justice and to serve on that august body, shaping it all along? Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're coming to you live from the Issues Etc. Making the Case Conference at Concordia University, Chicago. Thanks for tuning us in. Mollie Hemingway joins us to talk about the judicial legacy of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. She is editor-in-chief of the Federalist, a Fox News contributor, a member of the Board of Trustees for the Heritage Foundation. Congratulations, by the way. And author of several books, including her latest, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. Mollie, welcome back.
It's great to be here with you.
You've been doing a lot of interviews on this book since it came out. Is there a question that you haven't been asked that you wanted to answer from this book?
I'm not sure there is. I have done so many interviews and I've been surprised by some of the questions, but the entire book is sort of an answer to the questions that I wish people would be asking about Justice Alito, and being able to write out that story at length about someone who I think everyone should know much more about and should respect much more has been just a very exciting thing for me.
I don't want you to give away your tactics and methods and sources, but how do you get access to a U.S. Supreme Court justice?
So for me, this is not something I thought I would be doing when I started out as a reporter. But a few years ago, Carrie Severino and I co-authored a book on the Kavanaugh confirmation, and that was called Justice on Trial. And for that book, we interviewed a ton of people in the Kavanaugh orbit, former clerks and just friends, people who'd known him from childhood. But we also interviewed quite a few of the justices themselves, because it was a book about this person. And It was the process of writing that book that made me want to write the Alito book, because I had to read all sorts of stories about the Supreme Court, magazine articles, books, and there was so little written about Alito. But when we interviewed the justices themselves, they were frequently talking about Sam Alito. They were saying, this guy is a giant on the court and nobody talks about him. And part of the reason why nobody talks about him is he's an incredibly quiet and humble guy. Most people in Washington, D.C., they're not like drunk on power, but they know that they're big hot shots. And so you see them at a party or something and everyone's swirling around them. And Justice Alito is very quiet, very reserved. He's brilliant, but he just doesn't really want to play that game at all. And so that's why I decided someone had to write about him, and that was before he authored the Dobbs decision.
So is the Supreme Court a non-partisan branch of government? Because in reading your book, there's a lot of politics swirling around in the heads of those justices.
No, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot, they deal a lot with political issues, but I do believe they are ideally non-partisan. Yes, they are appointed by a Republican or a Democrat, and yes, that tends to tell us something about the type of justice they will be. So there are 6 Republican-appointed justices right now. 5 of them self-identify as originalists, meaning that they attempt to adhere to the original meaning of the Constitution. So they tend to be kind of on the same side. But speaking of what we just heard about from Dr. Don, the founders envisioned the Supreme Court as being protected from politics. They have lifetime appointments so that they don't have to make people politically happy with their decisions. You can't cut their pay. You know, it says that in the Constitution, so that Congress can't get mad at how they're ruling and punish them. They can't easily be impeached. These are things designed to inoculate them from the politics that are so present in particularly the first article branch of Congress.
You mentioned the originalists, but you refer to Alito as a practical originalist. What does that mean?
So that's a term that he used to describe himself. There are many ways in which he's more practical than his colleagues. So if we know about justices on the court, we probably know a lot about Antonin Scalia, who died in 2016, or Clarence Thomas, who's been on the court for 35 years. And these are people we also identify with originalism. Scalia is one of the fathers of this approach to how to interpret the Constitution. Scalia and Thomas, both amazing justices, they tend to be really big picture in their thinking. They start with the ultimate principle in mind, and then they have these big opinions that deal with those big philosophical approaches. Alito is more likely to look at the particulars of a case and decide just the case in front of him. Also because he was an appeals court judge for 15 years, and because he was a U.S. attorney out of New Jersey and he worked at the Department of Justice, he's thinking through, okay, we've got this big opinion coming out. How are the lower courts going to use this when they're applying it to their cases? How will people who are engaged in law enforcement, how are they going to understand how to apply this? And so he's also just more focused, on the application than some of his colleagues are.
So I mentioned before that the Supreme Court is something of a black box. We get to hear oral arguments, but the rest of the process is, we know they have clerks, they write opinions. With your access, did you get a better insight into how the thing works, how the Supreme Court functions?
I did. That was one of the things that was most fun for me. As someone who doesn't cover the court regularly, I've written previously about it for books, I write about opinions, but to be able to kind of peel that curtain, or peel it back and look into how they're doing things. And a lot of what the book gets into is some of that process. Since Justice Alito authored the Dobbs decision, which was that decision that was leaked, it's just such an interesting story. How Dobbs got picked up by the court, how they argued internally about where they were going to be on that, how the decision was written, drafted, how all that stuff sort of behind the scenes that I was able to tell that was fun. And I don't think people realize that it's a pretty small branch of government. You've got the 9 justices. They have 4 clerks a year, and they only serve for a 1-year term. And then they have 3 staff members That's for each chamber. 4 clerks, 3 staff members. The Chief Justice has, for administrative reasons, there are some police officers and some groundskeepers, but it's a very small group of people there. And so it was fun to interview people from all of that. I interviewed nearly 100 people for the book, most of the justices, tons of clerks from different chambers, and also some permanent staff.
It's often perceived as this society of mutual respect, and they don't speak ill of each other and that kind of stuff. Is that all true? Is there an ethos on the court that of that tenor?
So it's kind of interesting where they're allowed to speak poorly of each other. You're supposed to speak poorly only in your written opinions. So they famously all sort of get along, but to go back to Justice Scalia, he would say the meanest things to his colleagues in his written dissents. So even though he and Justice Thomas, they tended to be aligned almost all the time, but he was very upset that Clarence Thomas had different take on a given case, and so he said that Thomas and his group had crafted a freedom-destroying cocktail of, something or other. So the next time they went out for drinks, Justice Thomas ordered a freedom-destroying cocktail, But you're supposed to keep it to your written word, and you're supposed to keep it to legal arguments. You are not supposed to tear each other down publicly. And we recently saw where Justice Sotomayor said something really uncalled for about Brett Kavanaugh, and the other justices basically forced her to apologize publicly for that. Because if you disagree with someone, put it into your work, sure, that's fine. But because these are lifetime appointments in such a small workplace environment, you're really supposed to work hard at that. And it has been a little more difficult in recent years. So the liberals used to control the court for many decades, and now is the first time we've seen of a majority of originalists. And the liberals are not handling it very well, and they're publicly tearing down the court, and they're publicly saying that the court doesn't have integrity. Now, just by way of example, when the court handed down Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion on demand, pretty much nobody thought it was a legitimate opinion. Even people who were pro-abortion said, this is not constitutional law, and it doesn't even pretend to be. Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself spoke against the decision. But you never heard any of the conservative justices say, this court has no legitimacy because it handed down Roe v. Wade. And they could have, but they didn't. But now, as the liberals don't have power, they frequently are saying this in ways that I think some of their colleagues find very unfortunate.
Mollie Hemingway is our guest. She's editor-in-chief of the Federalist. We're talking about the judicial legacy of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. We'll get to the phrase, let justice be done though the heavens fall, next.
This week on The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, we continue our walk through Psalm 119 with How Long Must Your Servant Endure? Fixed in the Heavens, Sweeter Than Honey, A Lamp to My Feet, and My Flesh Trembles. Join me, Pastor Will Whedon, for The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, your daily 15-minute verse-by-verse Bible study on demand. Listen at thewordendures.org or your favorite podcast provider.
We know that you want to build your family on the right foundation from the very start, the foundation of Jesus Christ. Concordia Publishing House offers more than 8,000 products for churches, schools, and homes, dedicated customer service, and an experienced staff to help you focus on what matters most. Click to connect at cph.org. Concordia Publishing House, listening, responding, providing for God's people. Concordia Publishing House, cph.org.
Lutheranism in the Public Square. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Give your students a classical Christian education with Memoria Press. Their curriculum focuses on what is good, true, and beautiful. They offer an accessible, mastery-based approach to the liberal arts and the great books. Learn more at memoriapress.com. Save $5 when you enter the coupon code LPR26MP. Memoria Press. Saving Western civilization one student at a time. memoriapress.com.
I'm Dr. Russell Dawn, president of Concordia University Chicago, reminding you about the Prepared to Serve Church Professional Guarantee. Any new student in one of CUC's 6 churchwork programs will pay no more than $5,000 in annual tuition and required fees, guaranteed. Prepared to Serve is a donor-funded initiative. Support future churchwork students by becoming a funding partner at cuchicago.edu/preparedtoserve. Concordia University Chicago. With Christ at the center, we stand tall for the church.
Welcome back. We're talking about the judicial legacy of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito with Mollie Hemingway. We're broadcasting from the Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference at Concordia University, Chicago. Mollie is editor-in-chief of the Federalist and author of the new book, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. By the way, we have a limited number of copies of this book for sale at the booth for Concordia Publishing House. Mollie will be signing those books during the lunch break tomorrow. Mollie, this phrase that is, you say, central to Alito's judicial philosophy, let justice be done though the heavens fall. Tell us about that.
In Justice Alito's chambers, there is this picture of him with the judge that he clerked for. And there's this Latin phrase underneath it, fiat justitia reat caelum. Yeah. I don't know my Latin. My best friend here, who's a Lutheran headmaster at a classical Lutheran school, can correct my Latin pronunciation.
You got close
later.
enough.
Okay. So, and it comes from this old saying about doing justice even though the heavens fall. And I thought it was so interesting because he took this to heart at an early age, and then it fell upon him to be the author of the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, everybody knew that this was a decision that had to be overturned because it was basically a mistake from the very beginning. The court that handed it down, they didn't really know what they were doing. They authored it at a time that nobody cared about constitutional law or pretending to do constitutional law. It was causing major political upheaval. It was making the court have to, when you have precedent, when you have a decision, there are precedents in play. And so they would, in order to uphold Roe v. Wade, they would be ruling in absurd ways on other cases. So it was just making a mess. But every time that the court almost overturned Roe v. Wade, the pressure would be so intense that the justices would back away from it. So in 1992, there was a case out of Pennsylvania called Casey v. Planned Parenthood. A majority was ready to overturn Roe v. Wade. And then Sandra Day O'Connor and David Souter and Anthony Kennedy formed this little trifecta where they decided to rescue Roe v. Wade. They rewrote it. They said, okay, well, we all know Roe v. Wade was not reasoned properly, but what if we said that instead of abortion being a right hidden in this part of the Constitution, we said it was in this other part of the Constitution, and they said, and by the way, now that we've done this, you're not allowed to fight about it anymore. This should settle the issue. And I'm sure you all remember that since 1992, abortion was a settled issue in the United States of America. It failed miserably. If anything, things got even more contentious. So every year, the court would be dealing with tons of petitions from states. Any state that tried to protect unborn children at any stage was, they were trying different ways to make it go through the Supreme Court. And the court was kind of sick of dealing with it, but everyone was still scared to overturn it. So Justice Alito helps shepherd the Dobbs case to get it so that the court agrees to hear it. And after the court hears that case on December 1st, 2021, I believe it was, that Justice Thomas, who was the justice with the most seniority in that group, assigns the opinion to Justice Alito. And he does that because Justice Alito knows how to keep a majority together. He knows that that this decision of all decisions that they're dealing with would have the most pressure coming against them. And so if a justice thinks, I really want this included, he just includes it. If they want something phrased a certain way, he's generous. He's like, that's fine, we'll include it that way. But he's also skillful enough to take people who have completely opposing ideas and keep them together in the majority. So Justice Thomas has very particular views of the 14th Amendment, and they tend to be more radical than a Justice Kavanaugh. How do you keep them both together on a decision? And Alito can skillfully write it. And so he had that courage to carry them through. He gets the draft done, and then it gets leaked. And this is why I think that this phrase, this Latin phrase about doing justice even though the heavens fall, I mean, the heavens fell. The justices immediately had their lives threatened. They had to be moved to secure locations. Amy Coney Barrett had to put on a bulletproof vest in front of her children. I'll note that quite recently, she was also the victim of an attempted swatting at her house. Justice Kavanaugh had an assassin arrested with weaponry, with a gun, outside of his house. The attempted assassin said it was his goal to kill him and 2 other justices. And to be able to have that courage to face down the threats to their lives and their children's lives, they had to do justice even in the face of all this. So I think it's just an apt phrase for Justice Alito.
So who leaked it?
Okay, so I do get into this in the book about the leak. When it was leaked, it was just this unbelievable firestorm at the court. It's a small community. They are all instructed about how to not even inadvertently leak any information from the court. They're very careful about, they'll burn and shred paperwork to make sure nobody can sift through the trash to find out what's going on. And so when this happened, it was devastating to the court. It is true that the Alito chambers in particular were kind of expecting something to happen, meaning if you study your Supreme Court history, you know the left is not going to handle any overturning of Roe v. Wade well, but still fairly shocked. And then I get into, I don't know myself who leaked it, but I do know who a lot of people think leaked it, and we have some of the people who have been publicly speculated about in the book, but I would not be able to tell you for sure.
So I would think that knowing how consequential that decision was going to be one way or the other, they would have been more meticulous than usual with how they handled the documents, and not less.
I don't think that's the issue. The thing is that clerks can work on a decision from home, and it is disseminated to the justices and their chambers, meaning their clerks, and their permanent staff could have access to it. The thing that keeps issues from being leaked constantly at the court is the personal integrity of the people who work there. And so it would be so easy to leak anything if you don't have that integrity. And in this case, I think for some people, they really do feel that abortion is sort of a sacrament for them. Killing unborn children and this purported right to kill unborn children is viewed in a sacramental way, in a way that makes it so that you could justify blowing up the court. I actually have it in the book, too, how the left responded immediately when it happened. You had people on the left just celebrating the leaker, calling that person a hero. You know, someone, Rich Lowry had said something like, I hope the justices have protection because they're going to need it. And you had people on the left being like, good, I hope they need it, because you had well-funded campaigns on the left of publishing the addresses, the home addresses of the justices, paying for people to go protest there. That's illegal, by the way, to protest with the goal of changing a decision. That's against federal law. And yet Merrick Garland and the Biden Department of Justice did nothing to stop it. You even had the Biden White House say that they hoped that the protests continued in the manner that they'd been going. And there were 100 fire bombings and other acts of violence against churches and pro-life pregnancy centers. It was extremely bad. And because the media tend to be pro-abortion, they weren't giving this the weight it was due. But as far as it truly was shocking to people. They felt that the world had ended almost with the leak, because anybody could leak. Actually, there's a point I will make on this too, that in Washington, people leak because they want to show that they're important. But at the Supreme Court, everybody is important. Like, you don't get to be a clerk unless you are the very top graduate of a very top law school. So everyone knows you're important. You don't need to leak. You really had to have a desire to blow things up to do it there.
Was there a thorough investigation?
No, that's actually I go into it in detail in the book. I heard no one, no matter the chambers, no matter, their position, justice, clerk, or otherwise, who thought that the investigation was well done. By way of example, so Politico, which is a left-wing DC political outlet, published the draft decision, and it had 2 authors. And so the Marshal of the Supreme Court was tasked with running the investigation. So she would ask people, did you leak the document? And you will be surprised to learn that everybody said that they did not. Instead of asking, do you know this reporter? Have you ever met this reporter? Have you ever communicated with this reporter? Are you married to someone who communicates with this reporter? Tell me about your document control when you were at home. Was this document ever open on your computer without you present? Things like that where people start to trip themselves up. No questions like that, just more like,
so it wasn't an investigation?
Not a proper one at all.
It was more like, if you leaked the document, raise your hand.
Yes.
Okay. Mollie Hemingway is our guest. We're talking about the judicial legacy of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. We'll talk about how he responded to the leak next.
Listen to chapel services live, weekday mornings from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Morning Chapel from Kramer Chapel. Live weekday mornings at 9 Central, 10 Eastern, 8 Mountain, and 7 Pacific at issuesetc.org.
Where is God's mission? God's mission is everywhere. Yes, it's far away, but it's also very near. It's as near as your congregation and school, your neighborhood, your family and friends, even as near as your home. Wherever you are, God's mission is in that place. Through His mission, Christ is bringing forgiveness, life, and salvation to people everywhere, even here, right where you are. God's mission here. Learn more at lcms.org/national mission.
Scriptural, confessional, sacramental, liturgical,
scriptural,
confessional.
At the very heart of the fast-paced Silicon Valley is Lutheran Church of Our Savior in Cupertino, California. Amid all that challenges the faith and all of the daily trials that beset us is a Lutheran congregation that is scriptural, confessional, sacramental, and liturgical. Learn more at lcos.org.
Sacramental, liturgical,
scriptural, confessional,
sacramental,
liturgical.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Your comprehensive source for information, teaching, and truth. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Thanks to the following congregations for standing with us by becoming an Issues, Etc. congregational sponsor: St. John Lutheran, Kewaskum, Wisconsin; Peace Lutheran, Camarillo, California; Redeemer Lutheran, St. Cloud, Minnesota; Zion Lutheran, Cape Girardeau, Missouri; Emmanuel Lutheran, Alexandria, Virginia; St. Paul Lutheran, Decatur, Indiana; Faith Lutheran, Beaufort, South Carolina; Calvary Lutheran, Elgin, Illinois; All Saints Lutheran, Charlotte, North Carolina; Bethlehem Lutheran, Jacksonville Beach, Florida; and Hope Lutheran, Granite City, Illinois. Find out how your confessional Lutheran church can support this worldwide outreach by including Issues, Etc. in your mission or advertising budget. Just go to issuesetc.org, click Support Donate, and print a one-page flyer. When your congregation becomes an Issues, Etc. sponsor, we'll publicize your church on the podcast, at our website, and in the Issues, Etc. journal. Welcome back. I'm Todd Wilkin. Mollie Hemingway is our guest. She has written the book Alito, the justice who reshaped the Supreme Court and restored the Constitution. One more question on Dobbs. How did Alito himself, the author of the opinion, how did he respond to the leak?
It was very difficult to know that your life is going to be in jeopardy. And so one of the things, another story I tell in the book is about how, this is happening in May after the case had been argued in December. He had gotten his draft decision done by early February. And one of the things I thought was funny, when he finished the draft, he sends it around to all the other justices, all of the 9 justices. And within 5 minutes, Justice Gorsuch responds, "Looks good to me," like I'm signed on to it. And that was how I think the liberal justices realized, they've all been working on this together before this draft got disseminated to them. And the other justices in the majority also quickly signed on to it. So that means everything was done. And that draft that got leaked from early February is almost word for word. I mean, there are very few changes with what was eventually published. So they're done. All they're waiting on are the liberal justices to write their dissent. As soon as that dissent is done, you can go forth. One of the behind-the-scenes stories I tell in the book is that the Chief Justice has a rating system for when a decision will be handed down from the court. Everything is rated A, B, or C. A means the opinion is done, the dissent is done, the concurring opinions are all in, and it's about ready to go. B means we're just waiting on some final edits here or there. C is nowhere near done. And he rates it a C. The Dobbs case is a C after the leak. And so Justice Alito asks his liberal colleagues, could you wrap this up? Because we are having our lives being threatened. And I tell this crazy story in the book about how after that judicial conference, which is just the 9 justices together who are doing that, Justice Kagan goes to Justice Breyer's chambers. And she went there because he was the justice of the liberals most willing to accommodate his colleagues who had written the majority. He's very, very liberal, but he cares about them. And he understood that them having to be moved to secure locations and not being able to live in their houses, that this was very, very bad. And Kagan screamed at him to not accommodate them, to make sure that he did not get this dissent out, which meant that every day they were having more and more attacks on their lives. Justice Gorsuch says to them, could you just give us a date by which you will be done? No date.
So they're slow-walking the thing.
Absolutely slow-walking it. They finally give a date of June 1st, but then when they turn it in, and in exchange for that, they were able to delay some other decisions. But when they turn it in, they have a footnote that references a case that really was still being worked on, and you can't reference the outcome of a case before it's handed down. So it delayed it another 3.5 weeks. And during that time was when Kavanaugh and his family were nearly assassinated. So I reported that in the book, and right before the book came out, there was this guy who doesn't normally do Supreme Court reporting, but he reported that these liberal justices were slow-walking a decision this term. It was the one dealing with the Voting Rights Act. I'm not sure if you heard about that, but they were slow-walking that. That had been argued in October, and they were waiting because the sooner it got out, the more legislatures could respond to it by changing the way that they allocate their congressional districts. And so this person reported that, I reported mine, and it looks like slow walking has become a political move from some of the liberal justices who are very frustrated that there are only 3 of them and that they don't have as much sway as they would like.
How else has Alito shaped the court over his long time?
So he's very strategic. It's interesting that the left always understood Alito was more important than the right did. You can go back and find liberal Supreme Court reporters pointing out how strategic he is about which cases get brought up to the court, how he handles oral argument. He's widely considered the best at oral argument. So when a case comes before the court, typically that means each side gets a half hour to make their case. The justices ask questions, the advocates respond. Alito and Kagan, on the left, are considered the two best at oral argument. Alito asks the question that just makes everything kind of melt away and clarify what the meat of the argument is. So even if he doesn't author the opinion, the justice who does author it will frequently pick up on what he did in oral argument. So he's very effective at that. And then also, we referenced how Scalia and Thomas are these big picture guys. Alito frequently agreed or agrees with them, but he thinks, how do we move to that place that Thomas says? So for the Voting Rights Act decision that just came down, it was a 6-3 decision authored by Alito. Thomas said, and the issue was, are you required under the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, to create racial gerrymandered districts? Now, you hear that and you think, of course you shouldn't create racial gerrymandered districts, but oddly enough, federal judges had been telling states they had to create multiple racial gerrymandered districts. 15th Amendment to the Constitution explicitly says you can't be racial on anything dealing with elections, and yet federal judges were saying you had to. So the case gets before the court. Thomas says, I think the entire Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. And Gorsuch agrees with him, but you're not going to get a majority of justices on the court to say that. Alito crafts a decision where you get a 6-3 majority saying that, of course, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act can't require racism in your allocation of congressional districts. So he might agree with Thomas, but he thinks how to move to that place. And the way someone described it was that Justice Thomas's chambers are like the deployed aircraft carrier, and Justice Alito's chambers are like the Green Berets, who go and make sure that the ground is ready.
Okay, but it works well together, right?
And they work beautifully together.
So there was another, you mentioned the justice's home. There was an upside-down flag controversy, and it really was kind of at the culmination of a lot of the threats against the various conservative justices. What happened there?
So, as the left has been frustrated with the court, they have gotten more personal in their attacks on Justice Thomas and Justice Alito. So as part of this coordinated campaign to go after these two justices who are the stalwarts on the court, we saw more and more stories about Justice Alito's wife, Martha Ann. Now, as quiet and reserved and calm as Justice Alito is, his wife, this is definitely a case somewhat of opposites attract. She is extremely funny, vivacious, very smart, and very much her own woman. And she loves to fly flags. There are flags everywhere. They have a beach house in New Jersey and they have a house in Northern Virginia. She loves flags. And I think it was partly because she grew up as a military brat and just got into it at that stage. So she had a neighborhood dispute, and we live in Northern Virginia too, so the situation in Northern Virginia involves that you frequently have crazy liberal neighbors, and there was a dispute with a liberal neighbor that escalated to the point that Martha Ann flew a distress flag at her house.
Upside-down American flag.
Yes. You can imagine Justice Alito drives home from the court and thinks, oh dear, what are you doing? Immediately asks her to take it down. She declines. And it becomes a story actually years later. Years later, neighbors, get this out in the papers. And the purpose of this was to get Justice Alito to recuse from all of the lawfare cases that were before the court, dealing with how Democrats are using lawfare to keep Donald Trump off the ballot or other things like that. And when it happened, Justice Alito wrote a letter and he said, "My wife is fond of flying flags. I am not." And he says, I asked her to take it down, she didn't, we both own this house, blah, blah, blah. And everyone's thinking, oh, there's no way that this is true. He's throwing his wife under the bus. And later, she was surreptitiously recorded by a liberal activist. And she says everything exactly as he did. She's like, oh, they think he controls me. He doesn't control me. She reiterated everything he'd said, but she's quite the character and very interesting. And as he pointed out in his letter, being the wife of a Supreme Court justice can be very difficult, and it makes you have to live a much different life than you otherwise would. He pointed out all the sacrifices she had made. And that's a big part of this book, too. I tell the story about how coordinated the attacks on these justices are. There are multi-million-dollar campaigns to destroy their lives. And so you see, if you're a liberal justice, you can go to the Emmys, you can literally appear on Broadway, you can go to fancy law schools and have the red carpet rolled out. And if you're a conservative justice, in some cases, you can't go to dinner publicly with your kids because you'll be killed. And you certainly don't get invited to the law schools, even the law schools that you graduated from. You don't get to take trips without ProPublica investigating everything about how that trip was taken. And this is a big concern for people who care about rule of law, because it's one thing to get a good justice who's willing to face that personally. It's entirely another for someone to say that they're willing for their wife and kids to go through this kind of attack on them. And it's why more and more people should stand up against it. And I think it was kind of disappointing how few people stood up against this activism campaign recently.
What has been Alito's approach to the administrative state?
So the court has had, I just want to point out, the court is in a very strong place right now for a lot of people who care about the original meaning of the Constitution. We heard from Dr. Don about the growth of the administrative state that coincides with the decline of the Article I branch, the legislative branch. And part of that was enabled through Supreme Court decisions. And it has been a goal of the Chief Justice, John Roberts, and other justices to make sure Congress retains its proper authority. And so Alito is part of that movement, although that is less of his issue than I think maybe a Chief Justice John Roberts issue.
We're talking about the judicial legacy of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, broadcasting from the Issues Etc. Making the Case conference at Concordia University of Chicago. Mollie Hemingway is our guest. What can we learn about the worship practices of the first Lutherans from a Reformation edict by a Calvinist leader? Find out in Will Whedon's column in the latest Issues Etc. journal. We'll send it to you for free. Just click the red journal subscription button at issuesetc.org and enter your email address. In the Wittenberg Trail feature, Pastor Michael Hughes writes about his journey from progressive Lutheranism to confessional Lutheranism. The Issues Etc. journal. Subscribe for free at issuesetc.org.
Luther Academy provides additional theological education for our mission partners around the world, specifically pastors who are asking for additional education but do not have the necessary resources in their own church bodies. By donating to Luther Academy today, you will be supplying food, housing, books, professors, and travel for Lutheran pastors who attend our conferences. To learn more about Luther Academy and how you can donate today, visit lutheracademy.com. lutheracademy.com.
The gold standard for Lutheran media. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Voting takes place this Saturday, June 13th through Tuesday, June 16th for President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. If you're a registered voter for the 2026 LCMS presidential election, please vote to re-elect Issues Etc. regular guest, Pastor Matt Harrison. If you're not a voter, encourage your pastor and your congregation's lay voter to vote for President Harrison. Official ballots have been mailed to all registered voters. Remember to vote June 13th through the 16th.
Your church service, sanctuary, and congregation are all unique, so why settle for low-quality recordings when your organist is unavailable? The Substitute Organist service from Church Music Solutions is genuine organ leadership using your instrument with your specific selections when you need it. Log on to churchmusicsolutions.com and request a free demo kit to allow you and your members to use the Substitute Organist service without obligation and without a sales pitch. Keep singing with Church Music Solutions.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're talking with Mollie Hemingway, author of Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. So, Mollie, let's talk about Alito. You say he has been not only insightful, but in many ways prescient on the issue of religious liberty.
Oh, this is an issue he has cared about since long before he came to the Supreme Court. And it's interesting. We talked about how he and Justice Scalia tended to be very aligned, but there was one issue that they differed on, and that is a case called Employment Division v. Smith. So this was something that Scalia authored that, in the minds of many people, restricted the rights of religious minorities. It dealt with a case from the Pacific Northwest of a Native American who was fired from his government job for smoking peyote, but that was part of a religious ritual. And when that decision was handed down, there was widespread bipartisan opposition to it. Chuck Schumer authored a bill. It had nearly unanimous support in the House and the Senate, signed by Bill Clinton, called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And back on the Third Circuit, where Justice Alito was, he immediately started working out how to protect religious minorities despite Employment Division v. Smith. And he got pretty creative about how to do it. And he has continued to care deeply about this issue. He's really the stalwart on religious liberty at the Supreme Court right now. You might remember he authored the Hobby Lobby decision, which dealt with how Obamacare was requiring family corporations to pay for abortifacients in opposition to their religious views. He authored the decision protecting their religious liberty. And he's cared about this so much. A couple of years ago, after Amy Coney Barrett gets on the court, there's a case that they hear dealing with whether a Roman Catholic foster care agency, whether they should have been discriminated against by the city of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia said you had to support same-sex couples or other groupings in order to be part of their foster care program. And it was a unanimous decision from the court that Philadelphia had violated this Roman Catholic foster care agency's rights. And yet, it was really interesting because Alito wrote a concurrence that was like, I want to say 87 pages long, all about Employment Division v. Smith and how this needs to be overturned. And people thought, this is very weird to write such a long concurrence. And the story there, which I get into in the book, was that he had almost been able to get enough people to agree with him. But Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett said they needed more time to think about it. And this is one of the things I get into in the book, too. You know, you have 5 originalists, and Barrett and Kavanaugh are 2 of them. And then you have, Alito and Thomas, who've been there for quite some time. And it's not that they disagree so much as that they have different ideas of how much time they have. So for Alito and Thomas, who spent many years on a court that the conservatives didn't control, they understand that control of the court is changing, always changing. Anything can happen. Whereas the newer Trump-appointed justices tend to think, well, I could be here for many decades. I'm going to take my time with all of this. And I think for the older guys, they think, we might not have time. We got to strike while the iron is hot, and there are a lot of problems that need to be corrected from when the court wasn't in such good shape. But looking at those dynamics and seeing that they're a little more nuanced or complicated than I think some people give them credit for has been interesting too.
What do you think Justice Alito would consider the biggest remaining threats to the court's legitimacy?
Oh, I think he would say that the biggest threat to the court's legitimacy is allowing it to be pressured for political reasons. One, he comes on the court at the same time as Chief Justice John Roberts. John Roberts was a few months prior. And at first, they were almost together completely. And then after about 6 years, Roberts does that Obamacare decision thing. And what was weird about that is that originally, the court had a majority to rule that Obamacare was unconstitutional. There was this massive pressure campaign against the court, specifically directed at John Roberts, saying, if you say it's unconstitutional, you will destroy the court's legitimacy. So he changes his vote. He changes it to say that it is constitutional, and he does it in a really weird way. He says, if we sort of rewrote this legislation, then it would be constitutional. Well, that's true, but that's not the job of the court. And so from that point on, you get this real big division between Alito and Roberts. And I think it's because Alito would say, allowing yourself to be politically pressured to change your decision, that destroys the legitimacy of the court. Because the court needs to be perceived as not being susceptible to that kind of pressure. And so when he sees people acting that way, I think he understands it for the threat that it is. The other thing is there are highly financed, well-coordinated campaigns to destroy the conservative justices. And to not have people fight back against that is also a threat to the courts. It's a threat to rule of law. And that's part of why I wrote this book, was so that people would understand how coordinated these operations are. It's not like when the New York Times writes a story, it comes from nowhere. It's a deliberate attempt to undermine justices and their opinions when the left doesn't agree with them.
What do you make of the Democratic Party's threats of congressional oversight of the court and packing the court?
Well, okay, so that is what I should have said was the answer to your previous question about what are the biggest threats to the legitimacy of the court. As I noted, Democrat-appointed justices have not dealt as well as they should have, in my view, with being in the minority. And the Democratic Party in general is not handling that well. You have seen increased open threats. Chuck Schumer threatened violence against Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch from the steps of the Supreme Court years ago if they didn't rule the way he wanted them to on an abortion-related issue. You had senators file a friend of the court brief that the Wall Street Journal hilariously dubbed an enemy of the court brief, where they said that if the court didn't rule the way they wanted on a gun rights case, they would pack the court. And you're now having people openly call for court packing. The Constitution doesn't set the number of justices at the court, so you could change it, but court packing refers to changing the number precisely to accomplish a political outcome. And you have many people just openly calling for that now. And I think, again, the court is not supposed to be political. And the court is actually better now than it has been in so long. You had decades where justices would openly admit that they were just ruling however they wanted, and they would say, we'll let the law catch up. All I care about is rule of 5. Can I get 5 people to vote on this? You currently have a very restrained and modest court saying stuff like, if it's not in the Constitution, we have to hand it back to the people. They're not radical. They're very moderate and very appropriate in behaving as judges. And the attacks on the court are a big threat to that rule of law that has been so hard fought for.
What will be Alito's legacy?
So most justices will not be remembered for anything. If you think about it, however many justices we've had, you don't know most of them. Or you remember them because they did something very bad. In Alito's case, if he's remembered, and I think he will be, it will be for Dobbs. I mean, this is a landmark opinion. It's like Brown v. Board of Education that overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. And Dobbs will be the decision he's remembered for, in part because it is so perfectly written. I mean that by that the liberal justices, when they read it, they were just blown away by how thorough it was, how it gave them no ground on which to fight, going through the history, going through all of the legal arguments, and doing it in a it really did kind of like settle things in a way that was quite nice for people who had been fighting about it. But a friend of mine had said recently, imagine being the justice who wrote Dobbs and Calais, which is that Voting Rights Act decision that was also very important. He frequently just has important decisions, and he quietly just keeps doing his work so that he doesn't get some of the acclaim that I think he should be given. And it's very important. Scalia and Thomas, 2 giants, more libertarian-minded. Alito is the conservative on the court. I mean, that's who he is. He's conservative. He cares about traditional values. He cares about families. He cares about safe streets. He thinks about how crime disrupts people's lives. He is the conservative justice. And as much as the libertarians get credit, and should, I mean, they've done some really beautiful things, the conservative should also be known by conservatives.
Mollie Hemingway is editor-in-chief of The Federalist, a Fox News contributor. She's a member of the Board of Trustees for the Heritage Foundation and author of several books, including her latest, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. Mollie, thank you very much. Next week on Issues Etc., we'll get a pro-life update with Dr. Michael New. We'll continue our series on Christianity and psychiatry with Dr. John Flo. And we'll visit with Pastor Joshua Pfeiffer, author of our book of the month, Lift Your Eyes, How to Live Outside Yourself. I'm Todd Wilkin. Go to church on Sunday. Good night from Concordia University, Chicago.
Listen weekday afternoons to Pastor Todd Wilkin and guests on Issues Etc. Issues Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is vital for the continuation and expansion of this worldwide outreach. Our mailing address, Issues Etc., P.O. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. You can also donate at our website, issuesetc.org. Issues Etc. is a production of LPR, Lutheran Public Radio.
In a world awash with all sorts of information, opinions, and ideas, there is still a place where God's Word is the central and only focus. Messiah Lutheran Church, 801 North Madison, Lebanon, Illinois. At 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings, God's people gather there to listen to Him. There you will find His words of law and gospel, and of course, our Lord's Holy Supper. Bible classes focus on the Bible and the Lutheran confessions. Come, listen, believe, and live, and check out our website at messiahlebanon.org.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jay Krause, principal at Metro East Lutheran High School in Edwardsville, Illinois. Metro East Lutheran High School engages young adults in a Christ-centered environment, delivering academic excellence and spiritual growth to develop Christian leaders for tomorrow. We provide a Christ-centered alternative to public high schools. We're currently enrolling students for the 2026-2027 school year. Learn more at melhs.org, melhs.org.